Good evening, good morning, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome, everyone, to the U.S. and China Charting a New Course. My name is Courtney Dogger, and I'm the president of Network 2020. And it's a real pleasure to be here today, partnering with the Institute of Current World Affairs on this wonderful and timely panel discussion on the U.S.-China relationship. Just a few words quickly for those of you who don't know about Network 2020. We are a New York-based nonprofit that is really bridging the gap between the private sector and the foreign policy worlds. And so we're looking to drive innovative solutions and research critical to impacting foreign policy challenges. In a moment, we'll kick off with the panel, but first I'd like to just turn it over to Greg Pfeiffer from the Institute of Current World Affairs for a little bit about their organization and for the bios of tonight's panelists. Greg?
Thank you so much, Courtney. My name is Greg Pfeiffer. As Courtney said, I'm the executive director of the Institute of Current World Affairs. It's terrific to be here. The Institute of Current World Affairs has actually had a long connection to China from our founder, Charles Crane's posting as ambassador to China in the 1920s under President Woodrow Wilson, when we have since sent many outstanding fellows to immerse themselves in Chinese society and become leading experts on China, including two of our panelists today, Cheng Li and Joe Battat, who was one of the only foreigners in Shanghai in the 1970s during his fellowship there. Today, the United States and China are in what most people agree is a new Cold War, thanks to their bitter trade dispute, which has begun to separate the two countries' deeply interconnected economies. President Donald Trump prompted the standoff to address what his administration describes as the authoritarian threat from Beijing. But the underlying differences are deep-seated, and now President-elect Joe Biden is promising to base his China policy on assembling traditional U.S. allies behind a unified strategy. The stakes couldn't be bigger. The battle concerns the future of the global economy and geopolitics, not least over information technology. Who will have the leading edge in 5G global networks, artificial intelligence, internet standards, and data? And the fundamental differences are over political systems, democracy and authoritarianism, human rights, privacy, and security. So how should the Biden administration set about charting a new course with China? Behind the rhetoric, what do the Chinese people think? What are the challenges and what's at stake? We have a stellar panel tonight to discuss these questions. Susan Thornton is a senior fellow at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center following a distinguished 28-year career at the State Department. Cheng Li is director of the Brookings Institution's John L. Thornton China Center, among other positions, and author of many books on China. And Joe Battat is a senior lecturer at the MIT Sloan School of Management, following 26 years at the World Bank, including as head of the Foreign Investment Advisory Services. Courtney, back to you.
There we go. All right. So thank you, Greg, for that wonderful introduction. Just to kick things off, and I'll start with you, Susan. As Greg pointed out, the U.S.-China relationship has had a lot of ups and downs, and in recent years has become increasingly tense. Some people are calling this strategic competition, some call it great power rivalry, some are even calling it a new Cold War. So how would you define the current relationship between the U.S. and China? And after Susan, I hope the other panelists will chime right in.
Well, thanks, Courtney, and it's really good to be with you and with my terrific co-panelists and with so many people from around the world, and I really appreciate people tuning in to talk with us about this, what is the most sort of crucial relationship between major powers looking out over the next century. And, you know, you mentioned the labels that have been thrown around, you know, new Cold War, strategic rivalry, strategic competition. You know, I think that these kind of labels are not doing justice to the extremely complicated and important relationship between the United States and China. And I think it's very important to be careful about what kind of language we use and to avoid sort of oversimplifying the picture and creating this kind of black and white, this kind of us and them dynamic with China. I mean, let's think about it. It's a fifth of the world's humanity. We have been working on the China relationship for 40 years, from the time of Richard Nixon, who's set out the mission 40 years ago as being one of trying to make sure that China becomes part of the world community and doesn't exist somehow separate and apart from it. And I think, a lot of people have now declared that mission as a failure. And in fact, I think Secretary of State Mike Pompeo went to the Nixon Library and basically declared Nixon's mission a failure. I'm not sure the Nixon family was aware of the irony of that. But anyway, I think it's really premature to declare that mission a failure. And I think this is a very big mistake that we would be making if we were to do so. The US has as its main comparative advantage in the international system the fact that it is the leader of this system. It developed this system. It's a system that has included many countries in the world, set up rules and institutions, the World Bank, where Joe Battat worked for so many years. And this is sort of the essence of our comparative advantage in international leadership. And I think, what the Trump administration has not well understood is the nature of that advantage and the power it gives the United States in the world. And the influence it gives us to set the agenda. And so, what I think we need to do going forward, rather than, sort of live in this anachronism of, major power competition going back to World War I or something, we need to look at the changes that have happened in the world, in the international order, in the world system, and see how we can continue this project, but maybe in a more effective way. We need to get 1/5 of humanity in China into the world community. It's not easy. I think all of us have worked on this at some point or another, and we know the difficulties, but if we don't do it, then I think we will set ourselves up for a failure, and we will not be able to reap the benefits of the kind of integration in the global community on a lot of issues that we would like to see. So, I prefer to think of it as, how are we going to figure out with China how we're going to coexist in the next century going forward? And how is it that the US is going to continue to be an effective leader of the international system that can integrate China?
Terrific. Joe or Cheng, how do you react to Susan's comments?
Do you want me to speak first?
Yeah, go on,
Yes.
please. Yeah.
Well, first, I would like to thank Network 2020 and the Institute of Current World Affairs for the kind invitation and for your long-standing renowned efforts to promote international understanding, especially for providing an access to grasp perspective from outside of the United States, which I have benefited enormously in my career. I'm also honored and humbled to serve on a panel with Susan and Joe, who both have inspired by my work for decades. Now, for your question, I think there was a similar question about China in the vice presidential debate a few months ago regarding whether the United States should perceive China as a competitor, a rival, or an enemy. But neither VP candidate was willing to give an answer. Why? Because the complexity of China, as Susan said so well, and it's very difficult to use that term to define such a complicated relationship. And also, I think the two vice president candidates, they certainly prepare for that question, but they still hesitant to do so because sometimes we should not misread a public opinion. Yes, some surveys show there's a very negative views of China in the United States, likewise in China. But on the other hand, I think that the impact of 4 decades, since Nixon and Kissinger opened China, especially the people-to-people diplomacy, I think there's a genuine friendship between two people. And China, for the United States, China is not our enemy yet, at least, and arguably should never be our enemy. I think that's the reason that these two vice presidents hesitant to answer. And also, this also show there's no consensus in the United States. So often people said that China issue is the only issue that the Congress agree by both parties. But I actually very suspicious about that. Yes, there's some legitimate concern in the U.S. Congress. There's some criticism shared. But I think even the Republican Party, current administration, they are extreme, hawkish policy toward China, especially the complete decoupling, actually received a lot of criticism from Republican establishment itself, from Henry Kissinger, Hank Paulson, Richard Haas, Bob Zoellick, Carla Hill. These are the former secretaries or very prominent leaders in the Republican Party in the U.S. government. They certainly are very critical. So, Susan said so well. I agree with everything she said. I just want to, from a participant perspective, to see that it's too early to give a concluding kind of use one term to simplify very complicated relationship. But we also should be cautious to not misread the public opinion. If we do, the backlash could be overwhelming. What I witnessed in China and in the United States is a profound kind of friendship. It will not be affected by at the time of the crisis. I think that I hope that people-to-people diplomacy, the shared design for peace and prosperity, the middle-class life dream, I think will prevail. But at the moment, of course, there's some crisis, there's some tensions, but overall, I think that we should put that in the historical perspective.
I would like to add a little bit to Susan and Cheng Li. First of all, I would like to thank you very much, Courtney, and the Institute of Current World Affairs for inviting me to be part of this panel, and to be also a member of this panel with very prominent panelists. I very much appreciate that. I don't need to repeat what Cheng Li and Susan said because I basically agree with them, but I would like to add a few things to it. Maybe it's unfortunate we're not going to be fighting, but I think we try to give a perspective of what China is to us and what we are to China. Saying that Nixon failed implies that we would have been better off having China completely closed after the Cultural Revolution, and China would have been even more closed out than North Korea is today. I went and lived in China when China was closed out, where Americans could not go and live in China. And do we want to have 25% of the population in the world in that kind of situation? Where at that time, China was exporting revolutionary wars and all sorts of things because it was extremely frustrated, it was isolated. And opening up the door to China, and China opening up the door to us, in fact, us meaning the rest of the world, is by far better, I think, than what the alternative would have been, having a North Korea of the size of China to deal with.
Thank you, Joe.
Do we want to be worried about the fact we do have issues with China? I don't think so. We have issues with almost every single country, or some of them bigger, some of them smaller. And it's part of the course. We compete with China in some areas, we collaborate with China in some areas, and in some areas we have some conflict we need to deal with. And there are ways of dealing with it. Unfortunately, the way to deal with it is not the way we have been dealing with it, at least in terms of tone and attitude in the last few years. And we hope that now with the Biden administration coming in, while the issues may be still the same, but at least the attitude and the tone will be hopefully different.
Thank you. Courtney, could
I
just add one
please.
thing? Because I think one of the things you mentioned, strategic competition and this rivalry, and one of the things that people constantly ask me is, what is the competition over? What are we competing for? And I think, you know, the fact that people have to ask that is, number one, very interesting. But number two, it indicates that, you know, I mean, it's not clear. And so I think when I answer this question, I always point to, because something happened, right, to bring this about. And I think there's really two things that happened to bring about this notion in the United States and some other places in the developed West, that all of a sudden China is a challenge or a threat. And you know, one of the things certainly is this issue of how to fit an economy the size of China that is not exactly like, or in many ways is kind of operating by a different set of rules from other, you know, economies that are in the international system. And I think that, and maybe, I know I'm putting this out there because I really hope that Joe is going to come in and correct my misstatements, but I really think that the economic picture is the thing that has really changed and sort of grabbed people's attention. And I'm not sure if that's because people were distracted by the war on terror from 2001 through, you know, even the recent period, or if there's some other reason that they didn't notice that, you know, China's economy was becoming a bigger and bigger weight in the international system. But the other thing that's happened, of course, because that's been happening since the 80s, the other thing that happened was, you know, a change in a perception that there's been a change in the momentum, in the direction of the trend line in China's reform and opening up. And, you know, I personally came back from Turkmenistan, where I was with you in 2014, to the State Department to start working on China again. And I noticed the difference. You know, I had been away from China for about 4 years. I came back in 2014 and noticed that, you know, it felt to me like China was what had turned inward and was closing. And there are a number of things I could mention, but so those two things in combination, for some reason, people felt all of a sudden the competition from the Chinese economy was growing and was less and less fair. And then another reason that, you know, China's reform momentum has really changed, and there were a lot of sort of negative things happening that indicated that. So, I mean, I think it's good to sort of put that out there because, I mean, it gives a little bit of texture for why are we having this conversation.
If I may supplement a little bit what Susan is saying, which I think is very interesting. Some of the competition is principally, in some ways, in my mind, at least because of my biases, my professional bias, is quite a bit in the economic and trade area.
Yeah.
And we are not happy, and the rest of the world is not very happy in some of the behavior of the Chinese government in terms of, for example, protecting intellectual property rights, and question of trade, for example, question of transfer of technology or forcing technology transfer. I must say that my unit in the World Bank in the mid-90s were writing reports to the Chinese government telling them exactly the same thing. And we kept on writing those reports and we kept on discussing them. It's not like it's something new. What's new is somehow, I agree with Susan, somehow we are paying more attention to those issues, maybe because we were distracted by other things, particularly the anti-terrorism in the 2000s, and also something else. The gap between the United States and the Western world with China was huge in the 1990s and 2000. So we did not perceive potential threat and potential strong competition. Now that gap is much smaller, actually, has been reduced, and then we need to deal with it. So actually, in some ways, dealing with these kind of issues are not something new, but I think there is a little bit more of a pressure to deal with it right now. It's a question of timing.
Thank you both. That's terrific. And thank you, everyone. I see there's a very active chat going on, and people are starting to put questions in the Q&A box, which is wonderful. I'd like to turn to you, Cheng, first for this next question, which So just last week, the New York Times published an op-ed by Fu Ying, China's former vice minister, in which she outlines a vision for co-opetition between Beijing and Washington. There was one particular passage that stood out to me when she's writing about U.S. policy toward Taiwan and the South China Sea, in which she asked whether or not Washington was siding with other claimants in the region in order to humiliate China as the imperialists did in the past. And that language of humiliation was really notable. And I wanted to get your and the other panelists as well thoughts on the extent to which is it a feeling of humiliation that is driving China, or is it something else? And really, what is the mood on the ground? What matters to people in China when it comes to the relationship with the United States, and how might that change with an incoming Biden administration? So Cheng, I'd love to hear from you on that first.
I'm glad you asked that question. From the Chinese perspective, the historical legacy of China's century of humiliation, this is a term China frequently uses, plays a very important role in China's decision-making process. In other words, without a thorough understanding of China's history, we cannot make sense of China's foreign policy behavior, and also cannot understand the rise of Chinese nationalism. Now, China is a rising superpower, many people observe, but it is also a divided country from the Chinese perspective because they call Taiwan as a runaway province. Of course, you may disagree with that claim. The Chinese believe that the United States wants to prevent China from obtaining its appropriate place, not necessarily a hegemony, but a major power in today's world. Now, let me give you some specific background. I think that it's fair to say relations have deteriorated at an astonishing rate during Trump's presidency, beyond anyone's imagination. Now, there's three fronts. On the economic front, systematic, complete decoupling. This is many people in China perceive, I think, with certain validities by the hardliner in Washington. They wanted to pursue that complete decoupling. It's not something remote and not just a scenario possible, but it is happening in virtually every economic domain. Now, you can argue that it will never work, but it's very, very close. I mean, my view is it's possible, but with huge cost. Now, just to give you one example, that the State Department, some officials claim that the U.S. business firms, let me mention again, it's a U.S. business firm that wanted to lobby for a better relations with China will be seen as the CCP, Chinese Communist Party's agent. They should register as such based on the FARA law. Now, how many American companies are willing to do that? But on the political front, the administration and adopted policy is really very close to regime change, called to overthrow the CCP rule. So you can imagine how Chinese government, the Chinese authority will respond, right? Along with that kind of thinking, there's a proposed ban of the Chinese Communist Party member and their families to enter the United States. As we know, there's 92 million Chinese Communist Party members. If you include their family members, direct family members, there were probably 300 million people. How could the State Department know your political background? So basically, if you are Chinese, you simply cannot, you will become suspicious. This is, I will call that the Chinese Exclusion Law Act 2020. It's awful. It reflects some, racism, McCarthyism, and etc. So certainly Chinese Communist Party take advantage of that. So Chinese nationalism on the rise. Now, finally, it's on the military and the security front in light of the US support from Chinese perspective for Taiwan's move towards independence. Now, US government may not want to go that far, but the Chinese perceive that way based on some of the incidents like Taipei Act, 2019, Taiwan Travel Act, along with some high-level visits, and it's kind of possible military kind of involvement. So Beijing has begun to more seriously engage in war preparation, and in Xi Jinping's word, China will use war to prevent war. So this is a very, very dangerous situation. That explain Fu Ying's article that explain Chinese perception, a kind of obsession with the century of humiliation, and China will react very, very strongly. So that's the danger. I'm not saying that it sounds like immediately there will be a war. I think the U.S. military is not willing to take that kind of risk, as, even Donald Trump or some of the hardliners want to do that. But on the other hand, we are moving that direction, but that should be fixed.
I would like to add a little bit about this question of self-perception within China and nationalism. Two very quick points. The first one is clearly the Chinese people felt that they have not been dealt a nice hand in the 19th century with the unequal treaties, for example, and centuries of humiliation. And it's very telling that Mao Zedong, for the first time, at least officially, in his speech at the first plenary political conference session, he said China stood up. And he said that on September 21st, 1949, 10 days before the official establishment of the People's Republic of China. So there is a high sensitivity, as Cheng Li mentioned. But this is only one side of the coin. I would like to add and bring into the discussion the other side of the coin. The other side of the coin is what's the perception of the Chinese towards the rest of the world? And just to give you an anecdote, of course, they're very, very much aware of the culture over 3,000 years. They are very much aware of the influence on the rest of Asia. For example, kanji are Chinese characters, and this is the language in Japan. And the anecdote is the following. I was living in Shanghai as a fellow of the Institute of Current World Affairs in 1979. And in July 1979, when the formalization was announced, the very first set of reform were announced in China, I was passing in downtown Shanghai by the People's Square, and there is an exhibition hall, a very small exhibition hall. The door was open. When you have a door open in China, you walk in if you want to learn about China. I walked in, and it turns out to be a very small exhibit with no object of exhibit apart from murals showing the map of the world twice, going from the east to the west, China, Europe, North Americas, China, Europe, Americas. And the exhibit is about transfer of technology. The Chinese show the transfer of science and technology in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, pre-Renaissance to Europe. Then it was showing in 19th century, 18th and 19th century transfer of technology from Europe to America. And then for that day, where we were there, like 1979, they were showing the need for a transfer of technology from the United States and America to China. And guess what is the next flow of technology? For the future, the flow of technology of China, from China to the rest of the world at an identified date in the future. That's kind of the perception, that the self-image they have for themselves. And they were writing this and they were showing this when the average Chinese had some problems in his nutrition, had not enough to eat, when the GDP per capita in the United States was 63 times that of China. And they have seen that they saw themselves as that kind of role in the world. That's the other side of the coin, the positive side.
Yeah, if I could just jump in quickly. I mean, I think it's really important to think about the difference between the government and the people. And I take what Cheng Li is saying from when U.S. government officials sort of denigrate the Chinese Communist Party, they are and say they want to separate the government from the people. That's not what I'm talking about. But I think, we think about the relationship between the people of the United States or the world and the people in China, and it's one thing. And then but the real problem is between the governments. And, this is common actually around the world. A lot of places we have, no problem with the people of another country, but we have a problem with their government. And I think a lot of the issues that we have with China center around this need on their part to be sort of officially recognized, legitimized, and earn, you know, to have the respect of the rest of the world. And so the 100 years of humiliation sort of gets at this feeling that they haven't been recognized in the way that they should be. And I think that's what sort of Cheng and Joe's comments both sort of point to that. You know, one of the things that the Chinese have put forward back in the Obama administration, and they're still putting it forward, is this notion of a new model of major country relations. And, you know, this is, you know, talks about no conflict and no confrontation and win-win outcomes. But then it's mutual respect. I mean, mutual respect is such a huge part of the sort of dance that you do in any negotiation with China, in any diplomatic encounter. And I think, you know, we can say, you know, we give you respect, we let you in the WTO, we're helping, we're building your economy. I mean, the Trump administration has said many of these things, but that isn't really what they're, that isn't really at the core of what is desired. And I think it's very hard, frankly, for the United States government to confer this respect and legitimacy that, of course, not on the Chinese people, but on the government of China. And we could talk, if you want to, in the discussion about that. But that has been a key. I mean, if you look back at the record of the discussions between Henry Kissinger and Zhou Enlai, I mean, this is kind of at the core of all of that. So it's still with us today.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that that whole concept of mutual respect, it applies in a lot of places, for sure. For our last question, really, before we turn to the audience, I'll start it off with you, Joe, as this really falls in our realm. But, you know, looking ahead, you know, I want to project a little bit into the future, even though I know a lot of panelists don't like to do that. But China's economy is already larger than the US in terms of purchasing power parity. And experts predict that it could overtake the US in terms of nominal GDP in 5 to 10 years. When this happens, with China as the largest economy in the world, do you think there will be a fundamental change in the dynamic of the China-US relationship?
In the last 30 years, China has performed from the economic point of view in a way that I don't think humanity has seen that before at the same scale. Of course, we know about that. We know the result of it. It's the second largest economy, or the first largest economy if you consider PPP. The per capita of income went from about $400-500 to about 10,000 right now, which is an amazing feat. And now China has, in some areas, some advanced technology in some sectors. But at the same time, when we start to be concerned, quote unquote, concerned about Chinese size of the economy, we also need to look at what are the challenges that China is facing in terms of its own economy. And China is facing tremendous challenges, which a lot of people who study China do agree on. One is its aging population. When you have an aging population, that affects economic growth substantially. And that aging population also creates a rapid rise in the wages. So China may become less and less competitive compared to what it used to be the last 20-30 years. It also reduced supply of labor. China still has a low urbanization rate. For an economy to be as strong as China, to be strong like the United States, you have to have a larger rate of urbanization, and China doesn't have that. 50% of the population, more or less, still live in the countryside. There is the efficiency of the state-owned enterprises, which are about 50% of the economy, and the Chinese government is struggling with it, as well as innovation. When you don't lose face by failing in China, then you are more likely to take the risk and innovate. So what I'm saying is that there are some cultural, political, and maybe educational kind of limitation to innovation. And this is precisely what Xi Jinping's economic program right now is focusing on innovation and on state-owned enterprises, those 2 points, because they know and he knows that these are a little bit of weaknesses in China. Now, the fact that Chinese economy is at the same level as the United States, bigger or smaller, frankly speaking, if it's $1 trillion bigger or $1 trillion smaller, it's not that important. What's important is whether it's competitive or not, whether also we could live together globally together and take advantage of the fact that China is rising. China rising means it's a market opportunities for anybody, including the US. So we should not look at it as a threat. I think we should look at it as an opportunity. And that's exactly what Chinese mentality is. When you do have a crisis, you see an opportunity. Weiji is both the crisis and the opportunity is in that term. So we should look at it as an opportunity. We should also look at as increasing the welfare of the United States population when we get cheaper and more competitive product from China. That benefit the general population, even though which I recognize, it put a specific group of people who are unable to compete with China out of job. But that is something that the globalization, you cannot do anything about it unless you go autarkic or unless you close your borders. And closing your borders, in my opinion, is not necessarily the best of options. The challenge, I think, in our dealing on the economic side with China is to encourage the country to truly introduce reform and address some of the issues that not only the US are complaining about, some economic issues that the US are complaining about, but the rest of the world actually, like the US, also have the same opinion that China needs to deal with it. I mentioned before the intellectual property right, that's really key. I mentioned also the question of trade and the issue of competition and fair competition. I mentioned the question of technology transfer. Now, in more recent years, the question of cybersecurity and impact on the economy. So these are the kind of issues I think I would be more concerned about to deal with. And if China wants to be, like Zelig said, a responsible stakeholder, then I think China needs to address those kind of things. The Chinese government know about those issues. As I mentioned, the World Bank have been writing about those issues and reporting about those issues to the Chinese government. And I think China, if it wants to have a place the way it wants to in the world, we need to also address those economic issues.
Maybe I can just come in quickly, Courtney. I mean, I talked earlier about this sort of anachronistic picture drawn by the idea of sort of strategic competition between major, powers. And the reason why sort of this is coming up now as being, the perception of China's economy and the perception of China's trajectory on human rights and its political and governance issues and its opening and reform. But there's another thing that happened on the US side that fits into all of this, and your question sort of hints at it, which is, in 2008, 2009, we had a major crash of the financial system in the US, and we cleverly renamed it the Great Financial Crisis to obscure the origins of this mess. But, this was a real blow, I think, to certainly the American family, the American worker, people who lost their houses, lost their jobs. But it was also a big blow to US prestige and the prestige of the sort of the liberal capitalist market, free order. And I think that also was a hinge point in U.S. China relations. I mean, a lot of people look at what this change was and they date it from, the installment of Xi Jinping as the general secretary of the Communist Party. But I think it really started happening earlier than that. And the financial crisis was I think a significant milestone. But what that means is that, as China was getting stronger and coming up and maybe we weren't noticing, we were having a blow to our confidence in our system. And, people talk about this phenomenon of sort of a relative power shift in the international system, which I think is a fact if you look at it objectively. But I don't agree with people who talk about, American decline. And I think Joe points now in his remarks that he just made to a lot of the, weaknesses, problems, and challenges that China has to deal with. And so, there are 4 times the population of the United States. It shouldn't shock us if at some point in the future their economy is bigger than ours. But that said, as Joe rightly points out, it's not the most important factor. It's the dynamism of that economy. It's the competitiveness. It's the dynamism and spirituality of the society. And there, the U.S. has tremendous reserves, and I think we have taken a blow, and we haven't shown a kind of a way to come back yet, but I think we can do that. And I think our system is going to be well positioned to correct and move forward and innovate and keep going forward. So in a way, this whole strategic competition, one of the problems I have with it is that I don't want us to be focused on China as our competitive target. I think we need to focus on what we need to do and not always be focusing on China. We need to make ourselves better, not be trying to trip up China. They have their own problems, they'll focus on them and they'll deal with them. The other thing to keep in mind is that unlike in World War I era, 1914, the world today is a lot different, and the challenges and threats are a lot different. Our borders are a lot more open, and we need that to keep our societies and our economies dynamic. But it brings with it a lot of new challenges. And so things like pandemics, we're in the middle of a huge pandemic. Talk about a blow to our confidence. So I think, pandemics, climate change, dealing with technology change, we don't even know, what are the implications of biotechnology and genetics and genetic technology, et cetera. All these things will need to be grappled with, and they're all going to be international, transnational issues, and they're going to plague every government, Chinese, American, German, or Cuban, so we need to focus on reality and what the real challenges are that are coming at us, and not look, sort of behind our shoulder or back to the past or whatever. I think we can do this, but it's going to take some serious leadership and some serious, digging deep to come up with some solutions on some of these things.
Well, I'm mindful that we have limited time and also a lot of questions, so I will be very short. While I disagree with the Trump administration's decoupling policy toward China, some of the arguments, including those made by hawks in Washington, in my view, are valid and revealing. As FBI Director Christopher Wray has recently described, the global economic landscape change in China's favor represents one of the largest transfer of wealth in human history. That was a transfer of wealth from the United States to China. Now, certainly that China's middle class is expanding, but the American middle class is shrinking. I don't want to give the detail. That's the reason that why Donald Trump got a lot of supporters by middle class in 2016, perhaps also in 2020. So my point is that China should really also have a sense of empathy to not just think that everything is America's fault. I found that a lot of people in China believe that because of China's rise, because the US want to contain China, but without look at the problem, like both Joe and Susan describe. There's a state capitalism, there's intellectual property rights violation, that China take advantage of American openness, American generosity. Of course, Chinese people is hardworking, and the Chinese government right policy contribute to China's economic miracle. But let's face it, China benefit from international system, globalization, and the openness of the West. But now towards the point that China face some problems, like Joe mentioned, but Western countries, including the United States, face also very, very daunting challenges. So that's why China should change some of the behaviors, should have the empathy, without which China will be in trouble because ultimately a lot of countries will, not only just the United States, not only just West, other countries will not be happy with the economic behaviors of China. So that's the things I want to add.
Perfect. Thank you for that. I'm going to turn to Q&A now, and I apologize. There are obviously many more questions than there are minutes left. So I'll try to group some of them. And you know, what I'd like to do now and kind of play, I'm going to group a couple of questions. And I think, Susan, you had touched on, you know, this idea of other, you know, the dynamism of the United States. And it actually echoes what Joseph Nye said. He was on here a couple of months ago. And that was also what he said in regards to China. Another theme that I hear a lot coming up, though, and this is something that I think is particularly resonant in this time when the United States is going through its own, really having to look at itself internally, particularly with social justice, is this question of human rights. And we have a question from, I believe it's Mira Eaton, who is asking about whether or not, as China is increasingly on the world stage with the US, you know, how does one keep up pressure about human rights? And questions about human rights continually arise. You know, we have a few in the chat room, and this is it's a common theme. And so, you know, how do questions about human rights get addressed in a changing dynamic with China and within the own US domestic context?
I guess you mean like U.S. diplomatic discussions and or surrounding China's human rights performance, right? Not the U.S. human rights performance.
In particular, but I think it does become increasingly hard for the U.S. to look outside at the world when quite rightly we need to do a lot of work at home as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is true. And Courtney and you know as well as I do as former diplomats, it's much easier to go in and talk to a foreign government about their human rights transgressions if you can point, if you can feel that your own country is living up to a high standard of human rights. If there's something that's just happened in the US that's problematic, then it always is a good talking point for the foreign interlocutor to come back at you with. But that's, I still think there's a big difference between the way human rights issues are handled in the US and the way they're handled in a place like China. And this gets to the issue of different governing systems, the efficacy of rule of law in other countries, the degree to which people feel secure and protected, in just going about their law-abiding business, et cetera. And so it's really important that we don't fall into that trap because, in the US, there's no more, sort of introspective and self-critical and self-flagellating government and society than the United States. Whenever we do something wrong, there's plenty of people around to investigate it, examine it, expose it, and continue to talk about it. So, and that's a strength of our system, and we shouldn't be shy about that. But, in talking to, we have this conversation all the time with the Chinese. I had a conversation the other day, where I brought up problems and transgressions of human rights with respect to Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy, how that's been violated. We had the arrest of, or the sentencing of some of the high profile democracy activists in Hong Kong today, and also the abysmal situation in Xinjiang. But these are just the latest in a long line of, people who've been working on China their whole lives could recite for you chapter and verse, all the cases and all the issues and incidents. But I think Xinjiang is really, about one of the worst sort of in the list that I can recall. And, you can't accept China's sort of false equivalence about, well, you have problems too. That's just not something that they should be allowed to get away with. I think the way to handle it is to keep, they don't like it when we bring it up. They want to be seen as a responsible country. This is important. There are some countries that don't care if they're seen as responsible on things like human rights protection or not. And I think we want China to want to be seen as responsible on human rights protection and rule of law efficacy, and we need to keep raising the issues where we see problems. We need to do it in sort of chorus with other countries who are willing to do this with us, and there are a lot of them out there. And we just can't be bullied by China or back down. I mean, we are raising these issues because and I think Fu Ying even said in her article in the New York Times that major powers can't keep their domestic politics inside their borders. I mean, they spill out. In the United States, our domestic politics spills out into the world. In China, it spills out into the world. And so the Chinese have traditionally said that, internal affairs are off limits and you can't, talk to us about that. But that is just not the case in an interconnected world like the one we live in today. And I think, over time, the Chinese will have to back down on that. And over time, they will have to make improvements in some of these areas. They're not going to change these policies under pressure from the outside world, I don't think, but they will, I think, gradually and incrementally make changes so that they can be, seen as being more responsible, and so that they can fit better into the international system. But it could take a long time. And I think that's just the way you have to do it. It's tough work. I mean, I don't think the sanctions that we've levied on these kinds of issues are particularly effective, but maybe we can think of some other strategies to use. But as a first start, unified pressure and diplomacy should be concerted and steady drumbeat.
Well, I just want to add one thing that I think the worst thing for U.S. to do is to have a double standard. I think that with the arrival of the Biden administration, certainly acknowledge the systematic racism and the problem of social justice in the United States. I think we are in a good position to regain moral high ground. Particularly inspired by Biden's statement in his speech after the election that we should lead by power of example rather than the example of power. And also Tony Blinken, the nominee for Secretary of State, he also said repeatedly that we should running for to high rather than running race for the bottom. So I think this is a good message. I think human rights is very, very important. I agree with everything Susan said, but how to deliver, how to persuade the Chinese people, right? And of course, at the same time, we also should understand some moral ambiguities and etc. It's we're dealing with an imperfect world, but how to promote human rights, I think is very, very important. I think that the Chinese should understand that with the new administration, we will be more emphasis on values, and but also start with the United States, but also hope other countries that also will do their own homework. So China is certainly will be very much on the spotlight.
To be much more effective, particularly with human rights, for example, and economic issues, I think if I may supplement to what Susan was saying, a multilateral approaches will be probably by far more effective than if we do it on our own. If the question of human rights are raised together with West Europe, for example, Australia, United States, Canada, etc., I think it would have more weight than if we are the only people who are doing it or doing it on our own. Same thing with the issues, the economic issues that we have. So I think shifting to a much more multilateral approach to things probably would be more useful and more effective.
Well, it sounds like we're heading in that direction anyway. So in my opinion, that's a good thing. So we're also getting a couple of questions on Hong Kong and Taiwan in particular. Actually, Taiwan keeps coming up. And so I'd like to turn to that briefly. Cheng, why don't we start with you on that? What do you think what do you think is going to happen with Taiwan? Will it become, quote unquote, another Hong Kong? And how does this fit into China's overall strategy?
Well, no one should compare Taiwan with Hong Kong. They are different. That even Chinese government handle this differently. But it's regarding Taiwan, it's a very, very tough question. I think earlier on I mentioned about the real danger. This is the issue area that the United States and China will be caught in a terrible, terrible war without the winner, because it could be escalated. So I think the point is that the United States should not underestimate China's determination, their sovereignty, they call the core interest. But for China, they should not underestimate the United States and the international community. They wanted to maintain peace and will not allow the use of force. I think this is very, very important. I think that should avoid miscommunication, should have established a mill-to-mill mechanism. I think you mentioned about the long term, we do not know. I think time will determine a lot of things. I think it's important to tell Chinese, it's your best interest to maintain a certain degree of status quo. At the same time, I think the United States should be very, very cautious in our policy. And sometimes it could be really, as Dr. Kissinger reminded us, that this is unique in history, that the two countries are almost equally powerful. And these are the two countries with nuclear weapons, and also AI, artificial intelligence, certainly changed the old dynamic, asymmetrical warfare. So that explains the 97-year-old gentleman still writing about the AI, So I think that we need to be careful, very, very sensitive about the both sides, and also the implications, the consequences for the world. It's a tough issue, but we should work together rather than just single-minded towards a confrontation that again with no winner.
Yeah, maybe if I could come in, Courtney, on these two issues. I mean, Hong Kong and Taiwan, I agree with Cheng, are completely different, and it's unfortunate that now they're being lumped together because they are completely different. But the way in which they're kind of similar, and why I understand people lumping them together, is that they're both situations where you have a system that's pretty different from the one on mainland China. Somehow having to, either in the far, far, far future, or in the less far, far, but still pretty far future, think about somehow transitioning or combining or converging with the mainland, right? And people very much oversimplify it and say, well, at the 97 handover of Hong Kong, people envisioned that China would be more like Hong Kong by now. I mean, that was really not true in 1997. And if people remember back to 1997, people were very worried that China was going to be a lot more intrusive and heavy-handed in Hong Kong immediately after 97. And people were kind of shocked when they looked back at Hong Kong, in the 2000s when I lived in Beijing, and said, actually, Beijing has maintained a pretty much hands-off policy in Hong Kong. So, there are reasons why things happen, and there's history, and there's points at which things could have gone a different way and decisions were made, etc. Now, the last, I would say, year in Hong Kong's trajectory has been really it's like a Shakespearean tragedy, where people thought they were doing one thing and it turned out they were doing something else. I mean, I just think that expectations got way out of whack, and people weren't thinking about reality, and people were very unhappy and frustrated and wanted to make that manifest. And now there's going to be a sort of long-term consequence for that. But the point in Hong Kong and Taiwan is to try to maintain the optimal status for as long as possible. And in Hong Kong, that's the high degree of autonomy that they get under the Basic Law from 1997 on. And in Taiwan, it's the you know, current de facto independent status that they have. And, you know, they have a pretty good situation in both of those cases. So you have to be careful about, you know, what more you wish for. And you have to be understanding of the realities of, you know, what potential decisions might risk. And I think, you know, the US has a very important kind of stabilizing role to play in the cross-strait situation. But our goal should be to prolong the status quo, which is basically de facto independent Taiwan, but a fig leaf of de jure unification from the perspective of Beijing for as long as possible, because I'm not sure what people gain by changing those things at this point. So it's a very delicate situation, and we hope that, you know, far-sighted leaders in each of these places would be cognizant of the very real risks that Cheng talked about, and the potential costs and the cost-benefit analysis there. You know, it wouldn't seem to make sense if you think about it. So I think that's where I come down on this.
Would I have time to eke out one last question? Is that possible?
Yeah.
Because Joe, I wanted to turn to you for this one. Morgan Moss is asking, how does Chinese ownership of the largest portion of U.S. foreign held debt impact the U.S. China relations, especially post 2008? And so how much of that, you know, we've talked a lot about political wrangling, and we've talked about economics in terms of world stage, but how does that particular relationship figure in?
If my numbers are correct, China, I think, owns about 7% of US debt worldwide. Some people feel that China holding this much could use it to leverage against the United States and put pressure on the United States. But, you know, when you do have trillions of dollars of T-bills and you want to start to sell it or dump it in order to punish the United States, you're punishing yourself first, because then the prices of those T-bills would go down. And that's not the kind of thing that the Central Bank of China, the People's Bank of China, would like to see, in my opinion. I don't think so. It will destabilize the economy, not only in the United States, if it does, which I don't think it does, but also in the rest of the world, if this is the objective to do that. To a certain extent, it's not exactly what I'm saying, but to a certain extent, if you owe a lot of money to the bank has to be careful how you deal with you in some ways. Mm-hmm. So I personally, although a lot of people are concerned about it because of the size of the holding, I'm not worried about it at all. I don't think so, because I think the Chinese will behave in a very rational way. I don't think the Chinese government is ready to hurt itself and hurt the rest of the economy. They depend on the rest of the economy in the world. So I'm rather optimistic that reason will hold and the right behavior will happen. I don't think something will happen along those lines.
All right, it seems like as my family situation slowly unravels here, I apologize if you start to hear dogs howling in the background. It looks like we've bumped up against time. It sounds like the situation is very tricky, but that history is not yet written, and that multilateralism is an important thing. And so we are looking forward to seeing, I think, what's to come in the next few months. With that, I want to say thank you, all of you. You're so incredibly knowledgeable and thoughtful about this topic, and I think injecting a little bit of nuance into this is quite important. So I really appreciate your taking the time tonight. And to all of you who joined, thank you. It's wonderful to see so much activity in the chat box and the Q&A box. I hope you join us for future discussions. We're actually doing a talk on Friday at noon Eastern time on the role of the UN in a changing world. So I hope you can register for that and join us. And a big thank you to ICWA for fielding two wonderful panelists, but giving them the background needed as well, and launching them on their journeys. It's really a terrific program, and I encourage everyone to check out their work. So With that, thank you very much to everyone who joined and participated tonight, and have a wonderful evening and a wonderful day.
Right, thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks, Courtney.